Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line of Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis in Siman Shin Mem Sif Yud Gimel. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanesidim Batzaru Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleim V'Yitziyah Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oiro Mishibur L'Geula Hashta Bagalo of Izman Kariv and Amar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Esther Fradl Bas Chana Moshe Meir ben Esther Fradl Yitzchak ben Sion ben Dusha Chavadasa Bas Chavadasa Bas Serolea. Gila Shifra Bas Ilan Udl Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana and Rivka Bas Shiralea. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sayv Shar Chel Yisrael. And as always, we are mispal that B'schus the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael, the Rebbe Shem should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael B'chol Makom Shehem. Okay, so today's Daf Kuf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph, is one of those very interesting pages in Shulchan Aruch, which in Mishnah Berurah, which proves the concept that people who learn Daf Yomi know so well, and that is that when you see a small amud of Gemara, it doesn't mean, today's Daf is going to be easy. When you have a small amud of Gemara, it's because you have lots of lines and lots of words of Rashi and Tosfos. And if you take a look over here at Kuf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph, what you'll notice is we have very little Mishnah Berurah to do today. As a matter of fact, I think today's shir, we're really going to do two oisios of Mishnah Berurah. We're going to do Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Mem and Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Mem Aleph. Okay, maybe we'll also do Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Mem Beis if we start Sif Yud Daled, which I hope we will. But take a look at the Biur Halacha that's going on over here on Kuf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. And the truth is, we're going to be covering Biur Halacha that starts already on Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis, Biur Halacha Dibur HaMaschil, Ein Shovrin. So you have a tremendous amount of Biur Halacha here. The reason there's so much Biur Halacha is because for very few words of Shulchan Aruch and very few words of Mishnah Berurah, this is very, very, very complex. And there's so much going on here between the lines, and that's why you have so little Mishnah Berurah, but so much Biur Halacha. So against that backdrop, let's get started over here. Very simple little sif in Shulchan Aruch. Says the Mechaber Sif Yud Gimel, Ein Shovrim Hacheres. You're not allowed to break away a shard of earthenware. Ve'ein Kairin Haniyar. And you're not allowed to tear off a piece of paper. Mipnei shu k'misakin kli, because by doing so, you are being over on the iser of misakin kli. Okay, the Mechaber doesn't tell me why you're breaking off this shard of earthenware. He doesn't tell me why you're tearing off a piece of paper. Simply read, it sounds like to take a piece of earthenware and break off a shard, or to take a piece of paper and tear off a piece, is k'misakin kli, and therefore it's usher. What kind of keli are you making? So let's take a look right away at Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Mem, where the Chavetz Chaim keys us in a little bit. The Chavetz Chaim says, Ein Shovrim Hacheres, you're not allowed to break off a piece of earthenware, ve'ein v'chulei, ve'ein karin aniyar, you're not allowed to rip off a piece of paper. Explains to Mishnah Berurah why you're doing this. Kedei lohaniach alehem, in order to put something on them, ukahai gavna, or anything that is similar to that. Now, if you take a look at the Be'er HaGoyla, at Ois Cotton Ayin in the Be'er HaGoyla, the Be'er HaGoyla tells you that the Mechaber is drawing this halacha from the Rambam in Perek Chav Gimel, halacha Vav. Okay, it's interesting that the Be'er HaGoyla chose to reference the Rambam. The truth is that this is really a Mishnah in Masechtas Beitza. The Mishnah in Masechtas Beitza says, Ein Shovrin Hacheres, you're not allowed to break off a shard of earthenware. Ve'ein Kairin Haniyar, you're not allowed to tear off a piece of paper. And then the Mishnah continues. Why are you doing this? Litzlais by maluach, in order to roast on it a little salted fish. And Rashi over there on the Mishnah is mefarish, and I'll read to you the words of Rashi. Rashi says, Kishetzoilin dogim al ha'askala, when they would roast a little fish on a griddle. So they had a metal griddle. When they would take a little fish and they would put it on the metal griddle, first, choitchem konim, first they would cut some reeds, oy kash shibolim, or some stalks from sheaves of grain, oy shoivrin charosim, or they would break off a piece of pottery, oy choitchen niyar, or they would tear off a piece of paper, and they would put it al gav ha'askala. They would put it onto the griddle so that they could put the little fish on top of this piece of material that is on the griddle. Why? Because the metal of the griddle gets very, very hot, and it would burn the fish. So we see over here what's going on in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is telling you, you're not allowed to go ahead and break off a piece of pottery. You're not allowed to go and tear off a piece of paper. What are you doing with it? What you're doing with it is you're going to use it to roast your fish. If you put your fish directly on the griddle, it's going to get burned. So what you want to do is you want to break off a piece. You're using it as sort of a little pan, as sort of a little, maybe a better word would be a coaster, but what we use a coaster for is to put a cup on. Over here, you need a piece of something to interpose between the hot metal of the griddle and the fish. Otherwise, the fish will burn. Okay, that's the Mishnah in Masechtas Beitza. Comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara asks, "My timer, why is this aser?" Answers the Gemara, "Mishum de kamisakin maneh," because by doing this, you're fashioning a keli. That little piece of paper that you tore off, you're using it as a keli. You're using it as something to roast your fish on. That little piece of pottery that you broke off, you're using it as a keli to roast your fish on. So the Gemara is mefarish the Mishnah, and the Gemara says, you know why this is aser? This is aser because of tikkun maneh. Now the Rambam that the Berurah brings here, Rambam Perek Chav Gimel Halacha Vav, basically just quotes the Mishnah. The Rambam says, "Ein shoivrinas acheres ve'ein koirinas aniyar mipnei shehu kemisakin keli," because by doing so you're being misakin maneh. So the Rambam takes the Mishnah, he puts it together with the Pirush of the Gemara, and the Rambam paskins like this. And the Rambam says, no, you can't do this. Now, there's a very important letter that the Rambam added. The lashon of the Gemara was, "My timer, why is this aser? Misham dekam misakein moneh," because you are fashioning a keli. Now, Rabbi Isai, by this point in Chel Gimel, we know that tikkun moneh could be an issa daraisa. So when the Gemara says the reason this is aser is because of tikkun moneh, you could look at this and you could say that this is a daraisa. But the Rambam adds a very, very important letter over here. The Rambam says, why is it aser? Mipnei shehu ke misakin kli, because it is like tikkun moneh. It is not tikkun moneh, it's ke misakin moneh. It's like tikkun moneh, which would seem to be code for this is not a daraisa of tikkun moneh, this is a darabanon of ke misakin moneh, and that's probably why the Berurah brings the Rambam and not the Mishnah. Because the Mechaber says over here, "Ein shervin acheres ve'ein karin aniyar mipnei shehu ke misakin kli." He doesn't say it's misakin kli; it's ke misakin kli, and that comes from the Rambam, not from the Gemara. Okay, so we have over here the first thing that we need, which is we now understand what the halacha of the Mechaber is. The halacha of the Mechaber is, you're not allowed to break off this piece of pottery, you're not allowed to rip off this piece of paper, because by doing so, you're doing something which is like tikkun moneh, you're fashioning something that you're going to use as a keli, and therefore it's an issa d'rabanan of kimisakin kli. Now really, there are two questions that kind of jump off the page that we really have to answer. The first thing is, and I'm going to say this question first because it applies to both cases of the Mechaber. One case is breaking off the piece of pottery. The other case is ripping the paper. There's a question, and that is, why is this kimisakin money? Right? I said, the Gemara says it's aser mishum, that you're being mishum de kamisakin money. You're making a keli. Comes along the Rambam, he says mishum, it's ki misakin money. Why? Taka, why is it ki misakin money? Why isn't it tikkun money mamish a deraisa? Why is it only a derabana? Question number 2 really pertains to the second case of the mechaber, which is where you're tearing off a piece of paper. And that is that if you're tearing off a piece of paper, why don't we have another problem that we have to deal with? Why don't we have an issue of kareya? We know that there's an av malacha of kareya. Tearing is an av malacha. So if you're tearing off a piece of paper, why don't we have a problem of kareya? Why are we reaching out to a isid rabbanon of kimisakin moneh, and why are we ignoring the isid daraisa of kareya? So those are 2 questions that we really have to answer. To answer those questions, let's take a look here at a very interesting Biur Halacha. Biur Halacha Dibra Maschel Ein Shovrin, here on Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis. I'm not going to go through the entire Biur Halacha. I'm going to skip around a little bit through this Biur Halacha, but I think it's kedai to see a beautiful Biur Halacha like this inside. Says the Chavetz Chaim, beginning with the beginning of this Dibra Maschel of Biur Halacha. Sif zeh, this sif cotton in the mechaber, va'asamach loi, and what's close to it, what comes next, humi loshen a Rambam perik chav gimel halacha vav and perik yud halacha yud aleph. This all flows out of the words of the Rambam. Udvaru b'sif zeh hu noivea mi masha amar bebeitza daf lamed beis amud beis. And this halacha of the Rambam flows directly from the Mishnah that I read to you on beitza daf lamed beis. And the Gemara over there says hatam damash v'lemoneh. The Gemara says the reason for this iser is tikkun moneh. V'lechayra lefi ma shemuchach b'sif hasamuch dikareya almanas l'sakin chayiv mishum kareya. We're going to see in the very next sif in Shulchan Aruch, in sif Yod Dalet, we're going to be introduced to the av malacha of kareya. So asks the Biur Halacha, according to what we're going to learn in sif Yod Dalet, this is an isid daraisa of kareya. When it comes to the case of ripping off the piece of paper, why aren't we concerned with the Isid Daraisa of Kareya? Why are we jumping to an Isid Rabbanon of Kimisakin Moneh? Void, and furthermore, asks the Biur Halacha, Dimiloshan Rambam Perik Chav Gimel Mashma Shehu Midrabanon. Like I told you, the Lashon of the Rambam is Ki Misakin Moneh. Now that Lashon connotes very clearly that this is only an Isid Rabbanon. And, says the Biur Halacha, there's another indication that it's an Isid Rabbanon. If you take a look at the context of the Rambam, in Perek Chav Gimel, the Rambam is very busy with Yisurei D'Rabbanan. So asks the Biur Halacha, I don't understand. From the Rambam, it's clear that we're dealing with an Isid D'Rabbanan. Yet, l'chayra, this should be also because of Kareya. So I don't understand. Why is this only an Isid D'Rabbanan? And he puts in here, it's Kareya al menas l'saken. You're tearing it. It's not mekalkel. You're not just tearing it to ruin the piece of paper. You're tearing it for a constructive purpose. You're tearing off the piece of paper because you need it to roast your fish. So it's kareya, and it's for a constructive purpose. It's kareya al menas l'saken. So l'chayri it should be kareya daraisa. V'em haya by mishum kareya, haya by yisira daraisa. Ube'emes kvar hiksha zeh b'prima gadim v'nishar b'kushya. And the Biur Halacha says that really the Prima Gadim asks this kasha, and the Prima Gadim doesn't know what to do with it. V'nishar b'kushya. So what's the first question that we have over here? The first question that we have over here is, I don't understand. We're saying that this is an Isid D'Rabbanan because it's Kimisak in Moneh? L'chayri it should be Kareya Daraisa. Why should it be Kareya Daraisa, explains the Biur Halacha? Because it's Kareya al menas l'saken. You're tearing off a piece of paper for a constructive purpose to have something to roast your fish on. It's Kareya menas l'saken, it should be an Isid Daraisa. Why is it put down over here as an Isid D'Rabbanan of Kimisak in Moneh? Okay, now let's skip 1, 2, 3, 4, skipping about 4 lines to the word velule. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Velule de mistafina. If I wasn't afraid, says the Chavetz Chaim in his great humility, says the Chavetz Chaim, Velule de mistafina. If I wasn't afraid, hava amina davar chodosh bazeh. There's a chiddush that I would say over here, says the Chavetz Chaim. Velule de mistafina hava amina davar chodosh bazeh. The loy shayich shem kareya almanas l'sakein. We don't call something kareya almanas l'sakein. Ki im kishikareya ezedava be'emtza. Only when you're tearing a sheet of fabric or paper in the middle. V'hu tzarich l'tikun shneim. And when you make this tear, you are doing a tikkun on the entire piece that you are tearing. I'll explain it more in a moment. Uke'ein shahaya b'mishkan. And that would be the format of kareya, the way it was done in the Melechas HaMishkan. Where did you have kareya? We know that every Av Malacha has to have a source in the Melechas HaMishkan. What's the source for the Av Malacha of kareya? Explains the Chavetz Chaim. She'yuriya shenafal badarna. If you had a uriya, if you had one of the tapestries, either the curtains or the coverings on top of the Mishkan that were made out of fabrics, and nafal badarna, a worm or an insect got to it and made a hole. How would they repair it? Kairin ba, first they would tear the area that they had to make a repair. When you want to make a nice, neat repair on a piece of fabric, in the old days when you got a hole in an expensive suit, you were able to give it to a weaver. And a weaver would fix it and you would get it back. You never knew that it was repaired. How do you make such a neat repair? The first thing that you have to do is you have to cut or tear a uniform area to repair. You can't have a jagged tear and repair it neatly. So you need to tear or cut in a uniform way and make a very nice uniform square or whatever it is that you're going to repair. So kairin ba, they would tear the fabric that they needed to repair, and then v'toifrenoisa, and then they would sew it up. And in that case, sha'akriya ha'isol tzarich tayeles kol ha'yuriya. So now, when they did kaireya on a uriya in the Melechas HaMishkan, so they had a sheet, they had a whole uriya, they had a whole tapestry, a whole curtain, or a whole section of one of the uriyas on top of the Mishkan. It needed a repair. They made a tear in it in order to repair it. But that tikkun was being done on the entire uriya. They're repairing the entire uriya. V'chein, and similarly we find in the Gemara in Shabbos. V'chein ma she'amar sham b'Shabbos adaf kufei amid beis, da'avdo ki kisisa. The Gemara in Shabbos on Kufei has a case where somebody sewed a beged. Somebody sewed a shirt. Somebody sewed a pair of pants. He didn't sew it neatly. And because of that, there's a bulge in the fabric. The fabric is supposed to lay nice and straight, and there's a bulge. Kikisisa means like a pocket, because when you have a bulge, when you have a fold in the fabric, it makes kind of like a pocket. So if somebody sewed a fabric unevenly, and now it was made kikisisa, and now there's like a pouch forming, and you need to repair it, what do? You tear it so that you have an opening, and now you can take it in to repair it. That's also a tikkun on the entire beged. So points out the Bir Halacha. We have two cases over here where we know that kareya is in Issa Daraisa. We have the kareya, the tearing that was done in the Melechas HaMishkan. They tore the uriya in order to repair it. That repair is a tikkun that's being done to the entire uriya. We have a Gemara in Shabbos. Somebody needed to repair a beged that was sewn because it was sewn unevenly and it was kikisisa. It formed a pouch. So they make a tear, and again, the tikkun is going to be in the entire beged. Gamken atayelasu litzerich kol habeged. Now skip like 2 lines to the words masha ein kain. The Bir Halacha is now going to contrast this to our case, where somebody tore a piece of paper off of a sheet of paper to use it to roast a fish. If you rip a piece of fabric off of a beged, right? Let's say you have a pair of pants that's too long. So you can make a hem, but it's 8 inches too long. You're not making an 8-inch hem. So you rip off a piece at the bottom, and then you make a 6-inch hem, right? When you make that tear, what are you being misakin? Are you being misakin the whole piece? No. You're tearing off one piece. That piece is going to be a throwaway. Or you're going to put it into your box of spare fabrics to make a patch. It might not be a throwaway, but you're not being misakin that piece. You're being misakin the pair of pants. So you're ripping off a piece in order to be misakin one part of what you tore. The pair of pants, you're being misakin. The leftover piece, you're not being misakin. So too in our case. You have a sheet of paper. You rip off a piece to use it to roast your fish. Okay, you're doing a tikkun on the piece that you need to roast your piece of fish, right? But you're not being misakin the rest of the sheet of paper. You might even be ruining the rest of the sheet of paper. Maybe you had a full sheet, now you only have 3/4 of a sheet or a half a sheet. So you're not doing a tikkun on the whole paper. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. V'kavanasa l'sakin bozeh habeged shehaya aroich. When you rip the hem off the pair of pants, your kavanah is to be misakin the pair of pants. But the piece that you're tearing off, lo yisukin b'zeh klal. You're not repairing that piece. Lo shayich b'zeh shem kareya al menas l'sakin. That, says the Chavetz Chaim, is not kareya al menas l'sakin. Kiyim shem acher. That's something else. What is that? Tahainu misakin moneh. Shehu misakin bazeh es habeged. When you tear the piece off the hem of the pants, yeah, you're doing a malacha. What malacha are you doing? Tikkun moneh. You're fixing the pants. But you're not doing kareya, because it's not kareya al manas l'sakin. Yeah, it's kareya to repair the pants, but it's not kareya al manas l'sakin on the piece that you tore off, and therefore it's not considered kareya al manas l'sakin. Skip another like half a line here. Now the Bir Halacha is going to say a few lines from now, like I told you, the same thing by our case where you're tearing off a piece to roast your piece of fish. You're not doing a tikkun on the whole piece of paper. You're only doing a tikkun on the piece that you tore off, but you're not doing a tikkun on the rest of the sheet, and therefore it's not kareya amanas l'sakin. So far, really, we've answered one of our original 2 questions. One of our original 2 questions was this case of the mechaber of tearing off the piece of paper. You're telling me it's an issa d'Rabbanan of kim misakin moneh. Why isn't it an issa d'Oraisa of kareya? And for the Bir Halacha, it's not kareya al manas l'sakin, because kareya al manas l'sakin is only when you're repairing the entire thing that you are ripping. So if you're the urea of the Mishkan, you're making a tear, you're being misakin the whole urea. If you're the piece of beged that wasn't sewn properly, you're making a tear, you're being misakin the whole beged. But when you're tearing off a piece and you're only using one piece, you're not doing a tikkun on the whole thing, and that's why it's not an issa d'oraisa of kareya. Now we still have another question, and that is, all right, so it's tikkun moneh, but why is it kim misakin moneh? Why is it a d'Rabbanan of kim misakin moneh? Why isn't it a d'oraisa of tikkun moneh itself? Says the Bir Halacha, V'toli hadavar ba'at tikkun. Now it depends on the extent of the tikkun that you are making. Imhu tikkun gamor, if it's a real tikkun, like you're shortening the pair of pants, and you're making the pair of pants a usable pair of pants, chayiv mishum makeh b'patish. That's bona fide tikkun moneh, aka makeh b'patish. The goymer akliyah beged. You're finishing the keli or the beged. That's an issa d'oraisa. V'im einoi tikkun gamor, but if it's not a bona fide tikkun, hum d'Rabbanan, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Ulekach, and against this backdrop, says the Bir Halacha, b'inyanenu, our topic over here, the Isser Sifyud Gimel, Shu Kareya Ezachaticha Niyar Midaf Shalem, where you're ripping a piece of paper off of an entire sheet of paper, Kidei Lishtamish by Ezadavar Ma, in order to use it for something. In our case, you're ripping off a piece to use it to roast the fish. Ubadav shenikri mimenu aniyar hazeh eino misakin klal. You're not doing any tikkun to the rest of the sheet of paper that you're tearing it off of. Ve'efshir de mekalkaloi gamkein. Not only is it not a tikkun to the rest of the paper, it might even be mekalkal on the rest of the paper. Ein zeh beklal karei amanas l'sakein. This is not karei amanas l'sakein. And v'toli adavar rak lefi atikun shenase b'chatichas haniyar shachatachai. And now, the status of this Isser, whether it's a Deraisa or Derabanan, is going to depend on the extent of the tikkun that you're doing. Usfir leila Rambam, and the Rambam held, that when the Gemara in Beitza says that the reason for this Isser in the Mishnah in Beitza is because of tikkun moneh, hainu denire kim misakin keli. It's only nire kim misakin. It's not mamish tikkun moneh. The lavkli gomer hu ayedezeh. You're not making a frying pan. You're ripping off a little piece of paper to roast a fish on. You're not making a frying pan. That's not a tikkun gomer. And that's why the Rambam puts this halacha down in the context of Isurei Derabanan. According to this, says the Bir halacha, if you took a sheet of paper and you tore up a whole sheet of paper into strips, and you have a use for every single one of those strips. So let's say you didn't take a sheet of paper and rip off one piece to use to roast the fish. No. What you did is you say, I have roasted fish for supper twice a week. So twice a week I need a piece of paper to roast my fish on. Here's a beautiful sheet of paper. I'm now going to tear 6 pieces to roast fish on so that I have for the next 3 weeks. I have the paper that I need to roast my fish. I could have supper 6 times from this sheet of paper, and you sit down and you make 6 tiers. It won't be 6 tiers actually mathematically, but whatever it is, you tear up the whole sheet of paper in order to make a bunch of strips that you're going to use to roast fish. Oh, then hu chayiv do karei amanas l'sakein. That would be karei amanas l'sakein, because then you're being misakin the entire sheet. You're tearing a sheet of paper into 6 pieces to have 6 pieces that you could use to roast 6 fish. And now you're doing it to the entire sheet of paper. So it's kareya amanas l'sakein to the whole sheet. That would be on Issa Daraisa. Okay, so that's the beginning of today's share. So to put it in a nutshell, we have a halacha here in the Mechaber. You're not allowed to break off the piece of pottery. You're not allowed to rip off a piece of paper. What are you doing it for? You're doing it to use it for something. In the case of the Mishnah, you're using it to roast a piece of fish. Why is it aser? It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. What Issa D'Rabbanan is it? Nireh k'mesakin kli. It looks like you're making a keli. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. Why isn't it kareya? It's not kareya because this is not called kareya amanas l'sakein. Why isn't it kareya amanas l'sakein? Because the Bir Halacha says a beautiful chiddush, kareya amanas l'sakein is only where you're being misakein the entire piece that you're tearing. So, if you would have a bolt of fabric and you would tear off a piece of fabric because you need a 6-inch piece of fabric, and you need that piece, you're going to use it for something. That's not kareya amanas l'sakein according to this. Why? Because you're not being misakein the rest of the bolt of fabric. You're only being misakein the piece that you tore off. Same thing here. You're ripping off a piece to roast a fish. Fine, it's kareya amanas l'sakein on that piece, but it's not kareya amanas l'sakein on the rest of the piece of paper. That's not called kareya amanas l'sakein. There's no Issa D'Oraisa here of kareya. It sounds like there isn't even an Issa D'Rabbanan of kareya. But what is there? An Issa D'Rabbanan of nireh k'misakein, because it looks like your epis making a keli. Why isn't it a D'Oraisa of tikkun moneh makeh b'patish? Because this is not a real keli. A piece of paper, a scrap of paper that you roast a fish on is not a real keli. But you are using it, so it's at least nireh k'misakein kli. Okay, let's go weiter. Let's go to Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Mem Aleph, which is a packed Mishnah Berurah. So we started off with one question of, We're saying that this is an Issa D'Rabbanan of Nirikim Misakein. Why isn't it Kareya? We answered that. Now the Mishnah Berurah has another problem. There's another Av Malacha that we have to worry about. And that's the Av Malacha of Mechatech. Mechatech literally means cutting. Now, Mechatech, we already dealt with Mechatech. I'm just looking for the, it's Shin Chaf Beis. We dealt with Mechatech in Siman Shin Chaf Beis in Mishnah Berurah Ois Koton Yud Ches. Anybody who wants to look at it, it's on Kuf Nun Beis Amid Beis, Siman Shin Chaf Beis, Mishnah Berurah Ois Koton Yud Ches, goes through the Av Malacha of Mechatech. Now, what is Mechatech? Mechatech is cutting. Where did you have Mechatech in the Melechas HaMishkan? Again, by the Urios, but more specifically, by the Urios that were made out of hides. So, one of the malachas that are involved in the preparation of hides is cutting the hides to a specific size or shape. So, they knew that they had to make Urios of a certain size. So, the first thing you have to do is you have to take the hide and you have to cut it to certain basic dimensions in order to be able to work with it. That is the Av Malacha of Mechatech. So something that's very critical in the Malacha of Mechatech is it only applies when you're cutting something to a specific desired size or shape. What the Mishnah Berurah is puzzled by over here is you're cutting this piece of paper or you're cutting a piece of, a shard of pottery and you're using it to roast the fish. Why aren't you running afoul of the Isser of Mechatech? And the Mishnah Berurah answers it very easily. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Kat Mem Aleph, Umayri b'she'ein makpid ala mida. We're talking about a case where it's not like the person has a griddle. You know, nowadays, the what do you call ready in the Betty? Everybody uses the Betty Crocker for, you know, it's a big fad nowadays. The little Betty Crocker cooking device. You can make breakfast, lunch, and supper. You want to go away on vacation for a month? All you need is a milchige Betty and a fleishige Betty and a parva Betty. You don't need any pots and pans. So, of course, came along the smart fellow and made sheets of parchment paper that are pre-cut to the round to the exact size of the Betty Crocker. So, over here, when you needed to roast a piece of fish, did you measure the griddle and cut a piece of paper exactly to the size of the griddle? That would be Mechatech. It says the Mishnah Berurah. It's not what we're talking about. Guy's a little fish, a little sardine. He wants to roast. He took a piece of paper. He ripped off a scrap. He put it down in the griddle. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Umayri b'she'ein makpid ala mida. He doesn't care about the exact size. He doesn't care about the exact shape. Mida means size and or shape. But he didn't care about the size, he didn't care about the shape. The Elavachi, because if not, yesh by gam mishum mechatech. Then we would have a problem of mechatech. Next. Vim kareya niyar l'karayim. We already spoke about this. If you would take a sheet of paper, we saw it in the Bir Halacha. Now we're seeing it in the Mishnah Berurah. If you would take a sheet of paper and you would rip it up into strips, kedei l'kaneach es atzmai bahen. Somebody, back in the day, somebody wanted to create a box of pieces of paper for use in the Beis HaKisei. So he cut strips. He wanted to have 20 of them ready to use in the Beis HaKisei, to clean himself with them. Or like I said, he cut up strips because he wants to have a stockpile of pieces of paper that he's going to use to fry his fish. Chayiv mishum kareya. That would be kareya. Shu kareya manas l'sakin. Ukid l'kamon b'sif yodalid. Now, as far as why the Mechaber over here is busy with a Darabanan of Kibisakin money and he doesn't mention Kareya, Ayin B'Bir Halacha. Okay, we already took care of that in the Bir Halacha. The case over here in the Mishnah Berurah that the Chavetz Chaim is saying would be Kareya Amanas L'Sakein is when you tore up the whole sheet. You tore up the whole sheet into Karoim, into strips, then yes, then it would be Kareya Amanas L'Sakein. Weiter. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'likraya igeres hamechutam. To tear open a sealed letter. Now, the first thing that you have to understand about this Mishnah Berurah is what is the scenario. It's not what you're thinking. It's not a letter inside an envelope. An igeres hamechutam is a letter that is sealed onto itself. One basic way to understand this would be a scroll. You roll up a scroll. Here you have the open end. You fold the open end closed, and you make a wax seal, right? You drip hot wax on it, you make an impression. Now the scroll is sealed closed onto itself. It's not sealed inside an external envelope. It's sealed onto itself. Or, for those, I'm dating myself maybe a little bit, back in the day when we wanted to send a letter to Eretz Yisrael, we used something called an aerogram, right? An airmail letter. What was an airmail letter? It was a sheet of lightweight paper. It was folded in thirds, basically. And also, it's sealed onto itself. It had the same way envelopes have the lick thing that you seal. It had that on one surface here. It had it on the sides as well. And it's sealed onto itself. That's what the Mishnah Berurah is discussing here. The Mishnah Berurah is discussing a letter or a scroll that is sealed closed onto itself. Okay, let's see what he says about it. V'lekraya igeres hamachutam, to tear open a sealed letter, says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu im yizaher shelo yishbar oisiyoi sachasima. Even if you'll be careful not to break the letters that are on the wax seal. They used to seal these things closed with a wax seal. The wax seal would either have a tzura, it would have a picture on it, or it would have letters on it. Some people would seal it with their name, right? So you have a wax seal, maybe it has the Weiss family coat of arms, and it says on it, Yisrael Weiss, and you seal it. So it has letters on it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even if you're going to be careful not to break the letters on the seal. Now, to break the letters on the seal is a big problem. What problem is it? Moichik, right? Where did we have that? Well, we just had that. We had that in this Siman, in Sif Gimel, right? Shin Mem, Sif Gimel, on Kuf Pei Tes Amud Aleph, in the Ramah. The Ramah spoke about breaking a cake or breaking a cookie that has letters on it. And the starting point of the Ramah was that that's a problem of moichik. We spoke then about cakes, and depends how, it depends what it's made out of. But whatever it is, definitely the starting point of the Ramah was that when you have letters and you destroy them, that is a form of moichik. That is erasing. So now let's go back to our case here. You've got this igeres hamachutam. You've got this letter that's sealed with a seal, a wax seal. The wax seal has letters on it. So first of all, says the Mishnah Berurah, even if you'll be careful not to break the letters on the seal, if you break the letters on the seal, you're already toast. Because if you break the letters on the seal, you're doing moichik, right? But says the Mishnah Berurah, forget that. Even if you'll be careful not to break the letters on the seal, rak yikra haniyar shesviva, you'll just tear the paper around the seal. Gam kain aser lekule alma. This would still be aser according to everybody. Now that's a loaded 5 words that we'll have to get to. But right now, for our purposes, says the Mishnah Berurah, that to tear the paper, to open up the scroll, is aser, code word in Chelik Gimel, usually for an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's at least aser D'Rabbanan l'kuli alma, according to everybody. Va'afilu loymar le'eni Yehudi, and even to do Amira La'akum on this. Now, if it would be an Issa D'Rabbanan, so then doing Amira La'akum would be a shvus to shvus. Even to do Amira La'akum on it, yesh lizair, we should be careful not to do it, im loy l'tzairich gadol, unless there's a great need to read the contents of the letter. If there's a great need to read the contents of the letter, then we could do Amira La'akum, shvus to shvus, according to some, right? So then we could do l'tzairich gadol, we could do Amira La'akum. Uba Aguda Kosov, but the Aguda writes, Sheyomer le'eni Yehudi eni yochel l'kroisoi kolzman she'en pasuach. What you should do is you shouldn't ask an eni Yehudi to go ahead and tear it open. That would be Amir al-Akum. You're directly asking the Ein Yehudi to do malacha. You're asking him to rip. Says the Agudah, don't do that. What you should do is, you should tell the Ein Yehudi, I got this letter over here. I'd love to read it, but as long as it's closed, I can't read it. I didn't tell him to do anything. And if the Ein Yehudi will understand, and he'll open it, then we don't have to worry about it. Why? This goes back, Rabbi Isai, to Siman Shin Zayin. In Shin Zayin, we learned that under some extenuating circumstances, we could use this kunz. This is not really considered Amir al-Akum, because you didn't tell the Akum to do anything. You didn't command him to do anything. You didn't ask him to do anything. You just told him, I wish I could read it. I can't read it. It's closed. So the Agudah says, in this case, where you want the letter ripped open, you could say, I wish I could read it. I can't read it. As long as it's closed, you can't read it. And if the guy chaps and he rips it open, you could go ahead and you could read it. Now, the truth is, we're 41 minutes into the shir. I could stop here. I read the Mishnah Berurah. I told you what the Mishnah Berurah says, but I feel like it's not fair. So I'm going to take the time to go weiter into this. So let's take a look again at what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here. So like I told you, he's talking about opening this letter or this scroll that is sealed onto itself. And he makes this comment, the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, Gam kain oser lekule alma. Everybody would agree. So right away you see that there's a difference of opinion, right? Why do we have to say lekule alma if there's no difference of opinion? So there's clearly a difference of opinion here. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, lekule alma, according to everybody, it's oser. So what's the question? The question is it an issa d'oraisa or is it an issa d'Rabbanan? That's where we have a machlokes over here. You know what? I'll take you through part of the Biur Halacha over here, just like I did in the previous Biur Halacha. Take a look here on Kuf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph in Biur Halacha, Dibur Hamaschil Haniyor. Have over here another, just a classic kind of Biur Halacha over here. So the Chavetz Chaim says like this. Ayin b'Mishnah Berurah. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Masha Kasavdu, what I wrote in Psichas Igeres when it comes to opening up this type of letter that is sealed onto itself. And by the way, this that I keep on saying, that we're talking about a letter sealed onto itself, we'll discuss a letter in an envelope momentarily, but you'll see why that's very different. Says the Biur Halacha v'avar k'tzas. Let me explain to you a little bit the background over here of the shaila of tearing open this letter. Ha-Pri Chodesh b'Yeridei Kuf Yud Ches, the Pri Chodesh in Yeridei Siman Kuf Yud Ches of Katan Yud Ches Kosav writes, the Yisrael HaPoischai, a Yid who would tear open this letter, Yesh Bazeh Chiyav Chatos Lekule Alma. Pri Chodesh says that to rip open this scroll is an Issa D'Oraisa Lekule Alma. Why? The Kriyas HaNiyar, because ripping open the letter, ripping open the paper, Hu Mekalkel, essentially, kareya, tearing, is an act of destruction, right? But you're doing it for a constructive purpose. Hu Mekalkel amenas l'sakein. This is kareya, essentially mekalkel, but you're doing it amenas l'sakein. Now again, in the Meleches HaMishkan, it was kareya amenas l'sakein because it was amenas litfor. You were making a tear in order to sew it up. Over here, you're not making a tear in order to sew it up, right? But you are making a tear for a constructive purpose. What's the constructive purpose, says the Biur Halacha? It's obvious what the tikkun is. The tikkun is, I want the letter open. So it's kareya, I'm tearing, which again, essentially is an act of kilkul, but the same way in the Meleches HaMishkan. I did kareya, which is essentially an act of kilkul, an act of destruction. But I did it amanas l'sakein, I did it in order to repair the area, and therefore it's aser. So too over here, says the Pri Chodesh, I'm doing kareya, I'm tearing the scroll, which is an act of kilkul, but I'm doing it for a tikkun. I'm doing it because I want to open the letter and read the letter. And l'chayre ain't tikkun gedol mizu. That's right. The letter is useless the way it is. I want to render the letter usable. I want to render it readable. So it's Korea, Amanas, Lasakin. So the Pri Chadash says, hello, this is an Issa Daraisa. And he says, L'kuli Alma. What does he mean, L'kuli Alma? I think what he means over here is, Sai according to Reb Shimon, who holds the Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa, is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. Sai according to Reb Yehuda, who holds that a Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa is an Issa Daraisa. This is not a question of Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa, says the Pri Chadash. Pri Chadash holds that this is out and out Korea Almanas Lasakin. Now, Chiddush the Pri Chadash is that it's very clear from the Pri Chadash that the Pri Chadash holds that the question of Korea Almanas Lasakin, the tikkun does not have to be in the paper at all. Because over here, I'm not repairing the paper, right? But I am being misaking the letter. The letter is not usable. Now, by tearing the letter to open it, I'm making the letter usable. So he holds that this is Korea Almanas Lasakin, this is Mamash and Issa D'Oraisa. So that's the first shita that we have to know here. We have to know that according to the Pri Chadash, ripping open this scroll is an Issa D'Oraisa. Now let's pause there for a second. If ripping open the letter is an Issa D'Oraisa, then certainly Amir La'akum is not mutter. It's not a shvus to shvus. It's a single shvus. It's a single D'Rabbanan. It's Amir La'akum on an Issa D'Oraisa. So there's no way, we're not going to be matter Amir La'akum on a D'Oraisa. So according to the Pri Chadash, we're not going to be so fast to be matir Amir La'akum on opening up this letter. Okay, that was shita number one. Now let's skip. Let's skip a little bit, like half a line. Now we come to another shita, the shita of the Chacham Tzvi. Says the Bir Halacha b'tshuvas Chacham Tzvi Siman Lamed Tes Polig al Zeh. The Chacham Tzvi argues on this Pri Chadash. V'hitter al Yidei Ovid Gelulim, and he's matir Amir La'akum on opening up the letter, which tells me right away that according to the Chacham Tzvi, tearing open the letter is only an Issa D'Rabbanan, not an Issa D'Oraisa. V'loi bir tamai, the Chacham Tzvi doesn't say why. So we have a Pri Chadash who says that this is an Issa D'Oraisa, Mamish Korea Almanas Lasakin. We have a Chacham Tzvi that says it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan. Since it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, shvus to shvus, especially b'makom tzorich, no problem, you could be matir it. But why is it an Issa D'Rabbanan? The Chacham Tzvi doesn't say. Says the Chavetz Chaim. V'nireh, it seems to me that you know why the Chacham Tzvi holds it's D'Rabbanan? Dehu Seiver du Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa. Because the Chacham Tzvi holds this is a Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa. Why is it a Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa? Dein Masakin Begufan Yarmini. Because you're not doing anything to the paper. Malacha Shetzricha Legufa. We've spoken about this 100 times. Classic case. Malacha Shetzricha Legufa. You have a nifter, a mace, in a house. To take the mace out of the house from Rosh HaYachid to Rosh HaRabim is a Malacha She'ena Tzricha Legufa. Why? Because when it comes to Haitzah, the Malacha that's considered Tzricha Legufa is, I have something in Rosh HaYachid and I want it in Rosh HaRabim. I need it in the Rosh Hashanah. So I want to transport it to the Rosh Hashanah because I need it in the Rosh Hashanah. So then I'm doing Haitzah Legufa. I'm doing Haitzah for the main purpose of Haitzah, which is because something is in place A and I need it in place B. But if I have a mace in a house and I'm putting it from Rosh Hashanah out to Rosh Hashanah, not because I want the mace in Rosh Hashanah, I don't want a mace sitting in Rosh Hashanah, but I can't have the mace in the house. So I'm doing it not to get the mace into Rosh Hashanah, but to get it out of Rosh Hashanah. That's a Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the Chacham Tzvi holds that tearing open the letter in order to read the letter is not a Malacha Shetzricha Legufa. The Malacha Shetzricha Legufa of Korea is I need to make a rip in order to then repair it. I need the rip. I need to tear the fabric in a uniform fashion so that I can then use that tear in order to repair the fabric. To tear a letter so that I could read the letter, I don't need the rip. I need a rip. No, I just need the letter open. So says the Bir Halacha, the Chacham Tzvi holds that this is a Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa. If it's a Malacha Shein Tzricha Legufa, it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan. And he brings over here, I'm not going to read this part inside, the Biur Halacha brings a Tosfos that is a very strong smach to this Chacham Tzvi. Tosfos speaks about another case. Tosfos says, what happens if somebody reads something and he gets really angry? Maybe somebody gave him a written contract and he gets really angry and he wants to show the people how angry he is. So he takes the paper and he tears it up into shreds to make an impression, to show people how angry he is. Says Tosfos, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan. Why? Because it's a Malacha She'ein Tzricha L'Gufa. I don't need the tears. I'm just trying to make an impression on people. It's a Malacha She'ein Tzricha L'Gufa. Says the Biur Halacha, that's this Chacham Tzvi. The Chacham Tzvi says tearing open the letter is a Malacha She'ein Tzricha L'Gufa. So far we have the Pri Chadash, who holds that tearing open the letter is an Issa D'Oraisa. We have a Chacham Tzvi that says it's a D'Rabbanan. Now he brings down a Nishmas Adam, skip a few lines over here, and come to Ubenishmas Adam. He brings a Nishmas Adam who also says that this is only an Issa D'Rabbanan, but he goes even further than the Chacham Tzvi. The Nishmas Adam holds that this is mamish not really Karei Almanas L'Sakin. Says the Biur Halacha, Ubenishmas Adam klal chavtes ois beis re'isi I saw shekosav de lekule alma potter. Nishmas Adam says everybody would hold that this is only a D'Rabbanan. V'toichet kavanasai deshani ahid de karei al meisai u'bechamasai. Nishmas Adam says this is even less than Tosfos' case. The hakriya gufa hu atikun. In Tosfos' case, when the person rips the contract into shreds to make an impression on people, the act of kareya, the act of the tearing, is what is making the impression on the people. Says the Nishmas Adam, not over here. Masha'enkin bazeh, the lahaniyar hu mekalkal gomor. Over here, when you tear the paper open to read the letter, the tear isn't a tikkun. It's not that, oh, now I'm going to read the letter using the tear. No, I'm not using the tear in any way, shape, or form. I'm just ripping the paper to get it open. But the ripping is an act of mekalkal, and I'm not using it in any way. By Tosfos, you are using it. It's the act of tearing that makes the impression on the people. V'atikunu mitzad acher. The tikkun is extrinsic to the tear. Yes, the result of the tear is that now I can read the letter. But it's extrinsic to reading the letter. So the Nishmas Adam says that this is a D'Rabbanan, but even less than the Chacham Tzvi. But now the Biur Halacha tells you the truth. I don't like the Nishmas Adam, and I don't like the Chacham Tzvi. Says the Biur Halacha be'emes, Loi brira svarasa yisvaras ha-Chacham Tzvi bazeh. It's not clear to me, not the svar of the Chacham Tzvi, not the svar of the Nishmas Adam. The Yadua, because it is well known. The Iker Tikkuni Geresh She'omed Likroisei V'Tikunai Hu Sheyuchal Likarenu. How could you suggest that tearing open the letter is not Karei Almanas L'Sakin? You have a letter that cannot be read. The tikkun of this letter is to rip it open. How could you put forth an idea that this is not Karei Almanas L'Sakin? And how could you suggest that it's a Malacha She'ein Tzricha L'Gufa? You're doing a tear to accomplish something with the tear. So he doesn't like any of it. So now, what do we see against this whole backdrop? What we see is we have a Pri Chadash who holds that tearing open this letter would be an Issa D'Oraisa. If it's an Issa D'Oraisa, we're not going to be matir Amir Lakum. But we have a Nishmas Adam and we have a Chacham Tzvi that holds it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan. Therefore, in the Mishnah Berurah chose to write that b'mokum tzorich gadol, we will allow you to do Amir La'akum. Why? Because b'mokum tzorich gadol, we're going to rely on the Chacham Tzvi and the Nishmas Adam, and we're going to say it's a shvus to shvus b'mokum tzorich gadol, and we're going to allow you to do Amir La'akum to get the letter open. Now, how about letters and envelopes? Let's be contemporary. Says the Biur Halacha. Let's do the math. Okay. Heicha diskura ha'igeres b'soich niyar acher kanog. But if the letter is not sealed onto itself, if the letter is enclosed inside another separate piece of paper, aka an envelope, bevadai ha'kareya ha'niyar ha'elyon hu bechlal makalkal. Certainly, when you tear up the outside envelope, it's makalkal. You're ruining the envelope. Upater afilu leRebbi Yehuda. Even Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa is an issa daraisa, but over here it's straight out makalkal. It's not karei almanas l'sakin. You're destroying the envelope. You're not being masakin the envelope. The chedarmin Shabbos ein gimel amid beis the makalkal pater afilu Rabbi Yehuda the svir lei the malacha she'ein tzricha legufa chayev. Val kein mutter al yedei ovid galulim b'makom tzarich devish vos tishvos. And therefore he says that to ask an Eini Yehudi to open an envelope, that would be zicher, a shvus to shvus, which would be mutter b'makom tzarich gadol. At the end he says, Hiviru mikomokim nira, the tzarich gadol yesh lahakal apascha yedei ovid galulim, ubefrat im higeres munachas pesach yaracher. In the end he says that even the scroll that's sealed onto itself, l'tzarech gadol, we could rely on the nishmas adam and the chacham tzvi and do amir la'akum. Certainly, if it's inside an external envelope, u'lechatchila tov yaisa lasis k'mo shekasafti b'Mishnah Berurah b'shem ha'aguda. But the best bet is to follow the aguda and not do straight out amir la'akum and just say, I wish I could read this letter, but I can't read it as long as it's sealed in the envelope. Okay, we're going to stop here. We'll continue next time with Sif Yadalid. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should send Yeshua, Sefuas, Panas, and Shadurchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the BS Gal Tzedek, B'meher v'yameinu, Amen. Be well.